Hello, friends. I'm Henry Prater. I'm the pastor at Edgemont UMC and making a little video to talk about a new project we're starting. Here at the church, we've been in the middle of a mental health and the church series talking about some of the various different issues, talking about mental health, how we as the church have dealt with it, maybe some of the ways we can do better as we look to continue to be with people in the future. And a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the church and anxiety, which was very appropriate because that was the very first Sunday that we started with our social distancing here in the state of Alabama, and our church didn't meet. I preached that sermon, which is up on YouTube, which you can find at the link that will be at the end of this video. But I preached to our worship team instead of a room full of people, and it was very weird. And for me, that threw me out of my routine. It brought up some anxiety. Normally, when I preach and talk to people, I can see faces, I can judge reactions. There's all of this back and forth that goes on between a person who's preaching and hopefully their audience. And we have this relationship, and it wasn't there except for just a couple of people. So it was a very surreal experience for me, and it was one that produced some anxiety. We're in times right now that are unprecedented for many of us. We're unprepared for that. We are at home more than we are usually able to, or maybe we're having to go out into the world into situations and we're not sure how safe that is or not. Our normalcy, our routines have just kind of been thrown out the window as we're dealing with this pandemic, as we're learning to social distance, as we're going through all of these different things. And it leaves us feeling very anxious, feeling very vulnerable, and not really sure what to do. So what we're going to do over the next several weeks is talk about anxiety, talk about how we can deal with anxiety, because there are some very concrete practices that we can do that help us deal with the emotion anxiety when anxiety wells up in us. But before I get into what those practices are, before I begin to lay out some of the how-tos, so to speak, I want to delve just a little bit deeper, because while anxiety is an emotion, the feeling of being anxious is something that we all have and we all deal with in response to external stimuli. Sometimes our own internal dialogue when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to being anxious, actually can make things worse. We can get caught up in anxiety and fear and stress because of what is going on internally. And we end up in a really, really bad place because of that. And I want to talk about that. It brings me back to a scripture that's become a touchstone for me for the last several years. It's Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. I want to read that for us. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with the question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Many of us are familiar with this passage. We know about the greatest commandment. We know about loving God and loving neighbor. But something that's become a passion for me to talk about over ministry the last several years is something that I know I overlooked for a long time and that I think we can overlook so often. And that is implicitly implied by our being able to love God and to love neighbor is loving ourselves, is being kind and compassionate towards ourselves. Now, most of us know that it's easier to love God. It's easier to love the people around us. But what we can so often forget is if our internal dialogue is unloving, if we're harsh to ourselves, if we don't give ourselves grace, we can often harden ourselves, and that goes outward. And we begin to be unloving to the people we love the most. That our relationship with God becomes difficult, because if we're made in God's image and we don't love ourselves, how do we love the one whose image we are made of? And it reminds me of the writings of someone who's become one of my favorite authors in recent years. She's an author and a researcher. She's been writing on vulnerability and shame and the lessons learned for many, many years. Her name is Dr. Brene Brown. She's given one of the top 5 viewed TED Talks of all time, The Power of Vulnerability. And one of the concepts she's wrote a lot about is called wholehearted living. And she kind of lays that out in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. In that book, she wrote, "Here's a tough lesson that I learned that day and every day since. How much we know and understand ourselves is critically important. But there's something that is even more essential to living a wholehearted life: loving ourselves. Knowledge is important, but only if we are being kind and gentle with ourselves as we work to discover who we are." Wow. This is coming from a longtime researcher and writer on shame and vulnerability who recognizes the centrality of loving ourselves if we want to live well, or she says, wholehearted. Allow me to share her definitions for wholehearted living and for love, which you can find on her website. Wholehearted living is about engaging with our lives from a place of worthiness. It means cultivating the courage, compassion, and connection to wake up in the morning and think, no matter what gets done and how much is left undone, I am enough. It's going to bed at night thinking, yes, I am imperfect and vulnerable and sometimes afraid. But that doesn't change the truth that I am also brave and worthy of love and belonging. Remember, y'all, our worthiness is not something we accomplish or having everything figured out. It is remembering that we are fearfully and wonderfully made by God, and God's work is wonderful. Love is defined as we cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, and when we honor the spiritual connection that grows from offering that with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. Love, while it is something we give and something we get, it's also something we nurture and grow, something that can start within us, something that we have to work at. And one of the best places to start practicing loving outwardly is being loving inwardly. If we are not resting in the knowledge that we are loved by God and that we are worthy by being loved by those around us, we are going to have a hard time being loving back towards God or back to those people who are around us. These times that we are living in are strange, they're hard, they're difficult. We don't know what's going on, and that can just cause our fear and anxiety to grow exponentially. And we can take that out on ourselves. But y'all, as we seek to have grace towards the people around us, we gotta have grace towards ourselves. It's okay to feel anxious and worried. It's okay to not have this figured out. None of us have this figured out yet. But that's okay. God has blessed us with some ways that even in the midst of this very anxious time, we can live our lives and get through this without having all of this overwhelm us and consume us. So I hope that you will join me and us here at Edgemont UMC as we take the next few weeks to talk about anxiety, to talk about some practical ways that we can make it through, because each of us are worthy of it and we can make it through. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.